when somebody innocently walks in and tries to pull a microphone over to themselves, it shouldn't create a domino effect that knocks all microphones in the studio over. Okay? That is not user error. That is a...
For the record, the only one of them fell over, not all of them.
It's negligence.
I'm imagining you getting up to leave after we're taping and accidentally dragging all of the microphones after you.
This whole studio is going to go up in flames.
Oh.
Okay, it's time for Sound Politics.
This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. Well, Scott, the governor signed the budget yesterday.
Yep.
Looks like this year's session in Olympia, it's pretty much done and dusted. No loose ends whatsoever.
Yeah, no, nothing else to follow up on. We can just take the week off, right, Libby?
Yeah.
Wait a second.
Wait
a second.
Hold up.
There is this small issue of a multi-front, impending legal challenge and referendum, maybe an initiative. All enemies, all sides, all strategies are coming for the millionaires tax, the income tax, the high earners income tax, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's true. So in many ways, the biggest fight of the legislative session, that millionaires tax fight, it's only just begun.
We're talking about, of course, this income tax passed by Democrats in the state house. It is probably the biggest piece of tax policy the state has maybe ever seen. It is a nearly 10% tax on income earned above $1 million, and it would go into effect in 2028 and impact about 21,000 households.
And almost immediately after the governor signed that tax, Republicans and business groups announced plans for a legal challenge and a referendum to try to strike it down.
And the dominoes, right, just started to fall. And Libby, they are probably going to be falling through the courts and into our ballots potentially for, maybe years, right?
Yeah.
That referendum that you mentioned is the first big domino, and we are going to talk about it today because it's the first big hill, I think, that tax foes are preparing to die on or live on. The same day that the referendum was filed, the Secretary of State refused to process it, effectively blocking it because the tax legislation included what's known as a necessity clause, as a kind of urgency-laden language that lawmakers can put in bills they view as necessary to the functioning of state government or the health and safety of residents.
Yeah, we talked about this at the time. Democrats say basically adding that language makes this legislation referendum proof.
Right. You can't repeal it right away or stop it from going into effect.
Yeah. But there is one big spender in the state who says that's just not true. And it's a name listeners have heard before. Brian Heywood.
Not only have they heard it, Brian Heywood's been on this show. Libby, you sat down with him again today.
Yeah.
And one little clip that stood out to me is here, before we dive into this, here's why he thinks this is a fight worth fighting.
So the legislature's basically said, we don't care about the Constitution. We're going to do this anyway. And the way that you know that they're thinking that is when they were asked about the legality of it, they said, well, that's not up for us to decide. That's for the courts to decide. So
Heywood is challenging the Secretary of State's decision to reject his referendum application.
Brian told me basically that the legislature uses these quote-unquote necessity clauses way too freely. The statute actually says to avoid a referendum, the bill has to be, quote, necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health or safety, support of the state government, and its existing public institutions. That's the direct language in the Constitution. And Heywood argues that the legislature needs to meet all of those thresholds I just said, not just support of state government. And he's basically arguing that this new tax, it's not an emergency, but the legislature is treating it like an emergency in order to keep him from using the referendum process. And he says that's wrong.
I want to just, before we jump in with him, I want to set some stakes here because this argument is about a lot more than just some arcane clauses or even state law, right? The law says that Heywood can't file a referendum. He's trying to do it anyway. Why do all this? This is my question going into this. Why do all this when he has another option, the one that he uses all the time? an initiative on your ballot to repeal this law, right? This necessity clause doesn't say we can't vote on this. It just means we can't immediately do a referendum.
You can't use the tool of referendum, yeah.
Right. Why doesn't he just use his favorite tool anyway, his initiative tool?
And why, Scott? Why is that?
Yeah, exactly. Why? The first reason is the one he told you, right, Libby? And he'll talk about that. A referendum is cheaper.
Yeah, it takes half as many signatures to qualify a referendum for the ballot. But there's also a shorter timeline. Heywood said he'd only have until early June to get all those signatures collected.
But there is another big one that I want to mention real quick because it explains why we're even talking about this. Libby, do you remember Heywood's slogan for Let's Go Washington in 2024, the last time those initiatives appeared on our ballots? Vote yes to pay less.
It was a good slogan. The idea back then was, so repeal the Climate Commitment Act and gas is going to be cheaper. So repeal the long-term care tax and you're going to have less taken out of your paycheck. Vote yes, and then you repeal the law. But those did fail.
It was a good slogan maybe, but it's kind of working at a problem they have. It's counterintuitive. Vote yes if you don't like a tax, right? The bigger psychological reason that political consultants tend to believe for maybe why it failed, other than, that it was Brian Heywood was massively outspent by the Democrats and their allies. Getting a yes from voters is harder than getting a no. Voters would generally rather say no to a ballot measure. I was talking to Sandeep Kaushik yesterday, friend of the pod, also a political consultant, and here's what he said to me about this question.
No campaigns are reasonable doubt campaigns. You don't have to sell something to voters. You have to point out the flaws in the other side's case. It's like a legal defense. You don't have to prove your client innocent. You just need to get a not guilty verdict.
And that's really what Sandeep did during those Brian Heywood initiative fights a couple years ago, right, in 2024. I mean, he ran the communications for the biggest opponents of those initiatives,
right.
Defend Washington, and they successfully persuaded voters to say no.
Right. So Heywood had to do the more counterintuitive job of, hey, people, vote yes to repeal the policy you don't like. Yes, if you don't like it, right? That's one reason Sandeep won. That is not how referendums are, right? And this is the key of what we're talking about today. A referendum takes that law, the millionaires tax in this case, before it goes into effect and says, hey, voters, weigh in on this. Should this law pass? And then they say no, or at least that's what, political consultants like Sandeep think happens more often. I don't necessarily see, I was looking back through the history of referendums, and I don't necessarily see evidence one way or another, but I don't have all the back-end private polling and data that Sandeep has.
But these are people who make these campaigns, and they're telling you basically it's a lot easier to make the argument with voters more straightforwardly saying thumbs up or thumbs down, something's going to go into effect. Like, it's way easier to just have a thumbs down. No, we don't like this law. Don't put it into effect.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying here basically is that Heywood is making this about a legal thing, and that's what it is about. But it's also a strategic thing. Strategically, it's easier for him to get people to say no rather than what he normally has to do with an initiative.
Yeah.
So that is what I think is the whole first chapter of the millionaires tax fight is about. What question should voters be asked? So with that in mind, take a break and talk to Heywood?
Yeah, sounds good. Let's take a quick break. Welcome back to Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann, and I'm here with the man behind one of the challenges to Washington's new income tax on high earners. Brian Heywood is the founder of Let's Go Washington. You know Let's Go Washington from initiatives on your ballot, like the 2024 challenge to the Climate Commitment Act. In fact, Let's Go Washington has already qualified a couple of initiatives for this fall's ballot, including one aimed at keeping trans athletes from competing in girls' K-12 sports. Now, Brian, you are working on a referendum to stop this new income tax. First of all, thank you so much for being back on the show. And tell me, you're the initiative guy. Like, we know you for initiatives to the legislature that have become law and also initiatives on our ballots. But you're doing something different in this case. You're filing a referendum, or you have filed it. Why a referendum, Brian?
There's a couple of reasons. In some ways, it's because what the legislature has done is in filing, in even the income tax itself, to me, not just to me, to our Constitution, is an illegal structure. So the legislature's basically said, we don't care about the Constitution. We're going to do this anyway. And the way that you know that they're thinking that is when they were asked about the legality of it, they said, well, that's not up for us to decide. That's for the courts to decide. And to me, that is a complete abrogation of their entire responsibility. That's not what legislatures are expected to do. They're supposed to uphold the Constitution. They're supposed to create laws that they believe in their best heart of hearts are in line with the Constitution. And they clearly didn't with the bill itself, the new income tax. But then they went a step further and they said, well, we don't even want voters to have a chance to have a say in this. And in our Constitution, there's something that very clearly outlines when they're allowed to do that. And the phrasing of it is very much, I'm trying to find the actual wording.
Would you like me to read it? I have it in front of me.
Yeah, if you would, please. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead. That'd be
so
great.
This is the necessity clause that you're referring to, and it's something that the legislature adds in order to basically try to say you can't file a referendum, you can't have voters review whether the existing law will go into place. And here's
if I can put a little bit of nuance on it, it'll be my own spin, of course, but I think it's a constitutional spin. There is no such thing as a necessity clause. There is an emergency clause, and that's all there is. And they've come up with this necessity clause to be able to get around the emergency nature of it. So go ahead and if you can read that'd be great.
Oh, so here's what it says in the Constitution. The provision is, quote, necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety, support of the state government and its existing public institutions. So that is what it says in the Constitution. And you are basically saying the legislature, by claiming they're getting around a referendum, they are not following the law. So tell me about that.
So as you look through the wording of that, it's necessary for the immediate preservation of, and then it has a list of things: public peace, health or safety, support of state government. And it's one phrase with a comma, a couple of commas, right? Immediate preservation of public peace, health or safety, support of the state government. It's the immediate piece that's very important here. It's the modifier for all the things that follow behind it. But when I got a letter from the Secretary of State's office rejecting, so they actually said, no, we're not going to allow you. We filed it. We paid our fees for it. They gave us a letter back, and you can find it on my Twitter page. I posted the actual letter they sent. They put two words into it. They said, or for the support of the state government. They made it into two phrases. And it's sort of incredibly telling to me. The Secretary of State's own letter to us misquotes the Constitution in telling us why they're not allowed to process this. And this isn't, you might say, well, that's just simply playing with words. No, the Constitution was written with real intent. And I think the most important thing about it was that the framers of our Constitution in Washington State, which I think did an amazing job. We have one of the best constitutions of all the 50 states. It really is protecting the voter, the citizen comes first. It starts off that way. It protects, it enumerates rights even stronger than perhaps the U.S. Constitution does. In this case, I believe they were very deliberate with a comma, not an or for, saying that it has to be immediate, and then here's the things that can be used if it's immediate. So critical thing that voters need to understand in this is that the Constitution was designed to put limits on what the legislature could do and what they could withhold from a vote. They were guardrails that were put on the Constitution. And what the legislature has done instead by this or for, if all you say is they can stop anything when they deem it necessary. Well, theoretically, one could make the argument that everything that the legislature does is supposed to be for the support of state government, right? And actually shouldn't be support of the state government, it should be for the support of the state. Maybe that's even worse, but everything should be in that alignment. But now with this or for, they've allowed themselves to just carve out anything that they want and say, no, sorry, you can't do it.
Brian, let me just kind of orient people if they're not aware kind of the timeline here. So basically on Monday, the governor signed the Democrats call the millionaires tax, the high income earners tax. Then on Tuesday, you filed this referendum, which would seek to have voters get a chance to say, yes, the tax should go into effect, or no, it should not on the ballot in the fall. But the Secretary of State said, no, we will not process it. And that's because of you're saying it should be called like an urgency or an emergency clause.
Emergency clause, yeah.
Yeah, because of this language in the bill itself. So now you're in a situation where you are going to do what? Are you going to challenge this ability for the referendum to go forward in court? What are your next steps here?
Yeah, we'll be filing a lawsuit here either today or tomorrow. We're just putting all the paperwork together. So we will challenge it. And I think this is not just a play of games. This is a very serious issue in the state. When the legislature designs for itself a permanent workaround, the referendum, I think it's an important thing. There's another part with the referendum. You need 200,000 signatures to get a referendum through, as opposed to that's including duplicates and all that happen. Whereas you need 400,000 to do an initiative. And the second part of it is that this is really, really a short time frame. So we'll be petitioning all the way to the Supreme Court to take, in our case, actual emergency action, because we only have until June 10th to be able to gather the signatures, which is an incredibly tight time frame. And so we expect the Supreme Court. This is something that is really at the very fundamental heart of how our Constitution and how our government works here in Washington State, or how it's supposed to work. We expect that they will take this up rapidly. And frankly, there's a lot of non-hope, I guess, on the non-majority side of the state, that are worried that the Supreme Court sort of writes its own rules as well. But I think you have to have hope that these people are responsible and fill that oath of office that they have as a Supreme Court justice, and will look at this in a non-biased way and say, yeah, this needs to go forward and address this question.
So this would basically break the Democrats' ability to use their term necessity clause as liberally as they currently do, which would be a big deal. I mean, this fight would address what you're focused on right now, the tax on high earners, but it would also be a battle over just the wider use of this clause to avoid referendums in the future. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, and I think I was just, Bob Ferguson just posted this is. It's not that they don't understand this. Bob Ferguson just vetoed. He did a pocket veto, or whatever. Not a pocket veto. He did a line item veto. It was on, which bill is it on? 2215, which is relating to the Climate Commitment Act. It was fixing some things that were messed up in the bill. But if you look at 2215, and he just signed the bill, but he did a veto of the emergency clause in the bill, because specifically in the bill, it said it starts in January. And he said, and they had put an emergency clause in, so it couldn't be vetoed or a referendum. And he said, it's his words. He said, for the reasons section of the bill contains an emergency clause that would make the bill effective immediately. However, the bill explicitly states that the regulatory changes go into effect in January 27. Thus, the emergency clause is not necessary.
So if you are moving forward with the challenge on the referendum, and again, the threshold for qualifying the referendum is a lot lower, but that deadline is coming up June 10th to try to get it on the ballot. What if the court does not side with you on the referendum? Are you going to have a simultaneous effort to try to get an initiative qualified? Or what are your thought processes with that possibility?
I think we absolutely have to be doing both in tandem, right? I would really, really maybe be surprised, but be very happily surprised with the Supreme Court standing tall and making this clear. But you always have backups. You always have plans that you put in place so that this contingency or that contingency. And we certainly are doing that, looking at whether it makes sense to do it to the people or to the legislature, both. So we're preparing for everything.
Would that initiative effort be for the 2026 ballot if you go forward with it? Or would you be looking at a future election on that? I mean,
no, if we do it to the people, it would be this year. If we do it to the legislature, it would go to them in January.
I guess my question on whether it would be on the 2026 ballot is because you've seen the national mood right now, and there is expected to be this big midterm backlash against President Trump on this fall's ballot. Wouldn't that be difficult to overcome for something that, you know, is a cause that skews a little more conservative? Wouldn't strategically you maybe be looking at like avoiding this midterm, you know, for this issue and maybe, you know, going at it in 2027?
Yeah, and I quite frankly, I think that's what the majority in Olympia would like us to be terrified of. But I remember not too long ago, there was a red wave coming. There's a red wave coming, and we didn't get anything more than we didn't even get a little teeny, you know, riffle in the water coming into the state on that. And there's a couple of points about that. I think certainly there could be that possibility at the national level, but oftentimes elections can be hyper local. And I suspect we've just had an enormous budget increase last year. Even before the ink was dry, we were already spending more money than we had. And so Bob Ferguson just signed again an unpopular income tax. We have 5 justices that are on the ballot this November. And I think there will be a huge reminder to everybody, depending on what this court does, that it matters who's on the Supreme Court. I went back and looked at the last 20 years of Supreme Court justice elections, and with the exception of Dave Larson, who lost by less than 0.5%, like 20,000 votes or less, right, in this state. Most of the last elections have been uncontested. And there's an organization called Full Court Press who has candidates or supporting candidates to fill those spots and at least be on the ballot. So I think that the whole system, our whole entire Washington system of government is going to be on the ballot, whether it's parents, whether it's soccer moms defending their girls in sports, or whether it's anyone that owns a business right now, or anyone that works for somebody that owns a business. This is a hyper-local issue, along with now Supreme Court justices. And I think part of the challenge, but also what our strategy will be, is to remind voters in purple districts, the legislator that you're voting for votes for the people that shove this income tax down your throat. And I think the other thing that's very clear is that they've tried to make this as an income tax that, you know, that only gets these rich guys in yachts, like it's some special class, but that's not who those guys. I've been on the phone with those guys. I've listened to what they're saying, and they've all got massive money being spent on financial planning and relocating, and they don't have to re-domicile. They can live wherever they want. What the people that are going to get killed are the farm owners in Yakima that own a decent sized farm, and their income basically flows through, the revenue flows through as income on their personal taxes. It'll be the restaurant owner that's busted his hump and now owns 2 or 3 locations, and he's got this, and that's all money that would go back into running the business or hiring staff. And that is a very, very real threat, one. And number two, what we're hearing from a lot of people is and I think they did a poor job of selling this. And this is where you'll see all the SEIU 775 money is going to go after this next part. But it's trying to convince people that no, really, they're not going to expand this. But that, even we know that's a lie. With the amendments were again presented to the legislature to say, hey, let's lock this in so that it never can go below $1 million. Let's lock it in. Let's give a surety to everybody. And I've never seen such. It was a game of dodgeball, squirming and dodging, and we don't want to lock in the future legislature from something that might be important. And it's very clear they have an intention. There's an old letter from Jamie Peterson that's floating around on Twitter, where he basically says the real key win in getting capital gains tax and then getting it challenged, or getting an income tax and then getting it challenged, is it'll open the gates so we can apply a broad income tax.
So let me ask you now about we've heard about how the referendum fight is about speaking to voters, but also addressing what you see as an overreach by the legislature using their emergency or necessity clause too often. Now let's shift to this constitutionality battle in our last couple of minutes here. Simultaneously, there is this other challenge happening, and we're expecting any hour now that a group that you've helped found, Citizen Action Defense Fund, is going to file a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of this income tax. And former State Attorney General Rob McKenna is signed on to help lead that effort. Ultimately, the group says that the graduated income tax violates the state's constitution because income has been ruled to be property in Washington, and our constitution says you have to tax property uniformly. So what are you hoping for out of this challenge, Brian Heywood? What are your expectations?
The first expectation is always that the Supreme Court will do the right thing. I think that they had to tie themselves into pretzel knots to find, contrary to all 49 other states and the IRS, that capital gains was somehow an excise tax. They've already had to torture themselves through it one time. And I sort of believe, I don't know, but I sort of believe that the reason we're going to have 5 justices on the ballot in November is because some of them on the court who are part of that don't want to have to go through that exercise again. So I'm expecting the court again to uphold its responsibility and look at this, because the Constitution it's not gray here. There's no wiggle room. What the legislature tried to do was to say, well, even in their structure, they said, well, this is really a tax on everybody, but we're giving, as one, the legislature said, we're going to give the first milli free, which was sort of the dumbest thing I've ever heard, as if they own the money. They're giving that an exemption to everybody. This tax applies to everybody, but they're given $1 million exemption is sort of the tactic they're saying, trying to imply that therefore it's equally applied to everybody except you get a deduction. So that's their way to try to get around it. But there's a second part of the requirement on the income tax, and that is that it can't be more than 1%, right? So they could at any time over the last 50 years, they could have done something that said, we're going to do an income tax that's 1% on everybody. And they've chosen never to follow that route. Instead, they're saying we're going to do 10% on the people with, on income over $1 million for now, until we, I wouldn't be surprised with the way they're spending. I really think it's not a zero probability that with the way that they're spending, and there's no control on their spending, that by the time this tax goes into effect, they will have already in budget session lowered the threshold. So I want to see, I would like to see the court very clearly, again, reaffirm the stare decisis, or I'm missing up my words, but
neither one of us went to law school. I don't know how to pronounce the Latin.
That's right. But it basically is the idea that they're supposed to give deference to earlier court rulings. And clearly there's some very strong court rulings on this in Washington State when it's been challenged before. So I'm hoping, one, that'll happen. I don't think that the case will get heard until into 2027 anyway. But it certainly will be on the ballot in November in an indirect way because of all the Supreme Court justices that are there.
So I know we're running short on time, so I just want to quickly ask, are you going to then also get involved in some of those Supreme Court races, like hoping that some of those 5 seats will shift a bit to the right and maybe be more open to the arguments that the Citizen Action Defense Fund are making about this? What's your expectation or plans for the Supreme Court races?
Well, I don't want them to shift to the right. I want them to shift to the Constitution, right? I don't want a biased, I don't want a court that's saying, oh, we're going to put our hand on the right or hand on the left. I think right now we have one that tends to, there's a study on Ballotopedia about Washington cases, and there's this overwhelming left leaning in plaintiffs and cases with left-leaning get more support than ones that are on the right. And I think it should be a 50-50. You shouldn't know, because it's conservative or Democrat cause, you shouldn't know that you have an extra opportunity to win at the court. That should not be the case, and it is right now. So I'd like to see the court return to a more neutral stance where it's not taking an ideological stance. So am I personally, Let's Go Washington won't be sort of raising money or doing any of that kind of stuff. But I certainly think that it's a cause worth highlighting. And especially because there's so much apathy in the state about judge races, because there hasn't really been any challengers for the last, it's okay, there's one judge, choose it unopposed, right? I think I'm excited what the full court press has done with finding people that are willing to challenge in all the races. And I will certainly be watching it and doing what I can to help out on a personal level.
Brian Heywood is the founder of Let's Go Washington. Good to connect with you again, Brian, and thanks for explaining all of this, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Have a great day.
So thanks to Brian Heywood for joining me for Sound Politics. And I know we're going to be talking to Brian more. He's got all kinds of things on the ballot in the fall and maybe one more. We'll see what happens with this referendum or initiative challenge.
I thought it was a good question to ask him. Do you really want this referendum up on the ballot in the fall? Because it is going to be a good one for Democrats. And while, all politics is local, I think we have definitely seen that Washingtonians get really fired up against President Trump. And, a lot of, pollsters and election watchers are really feeling like it's not just Democrats who are pissed about the war in Iran and a lot of the moves that Trump has made. We'll see how that bubbles over into the populist arena of the millionaires tax and taxing the rich.
Yeah, he seems to think he can make that more local argument and people will differentiate. And again, the idea that, hey, the income tax will be coming for you eventually,
right,
could be a potent argument.
Yeah, that maybe Democrats even, or at least independents, are feeling overtaxed. I just haven't seen any evidence for that yet. I was looking for it last year in some of our elections. I didn't see it. The Democrats who voted for more taxes won against Republicans or even other Democrats who said, wait a second, I'm feeling overtaxed. So
yeah, and voters upheld the capital gains tax in the challenge in 2024. That's definitely something that we heard from the supporters of this tax.
Yeah, but money is the thing that makes those arguments really well, right? And we didn't see a lot of money spent last year. And guess what? Brian Heywood has a lot of.
Although he would say not nearly, and it's borne out.
As much as the Democrats?
Not
That's
nearly
true.
as much as the Democrats and
the Democrats
and Labor
have way
money.
more.
Yeah.
That's true. Labor has way more. So it's going to be, a fun year? I don't know. We'll see.
Hey, if you're nerds like us, it's fun. Yeah, we like talking about it. That's it for Sound Politics today. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Kat Smith. Our producer is Hans Anderson.
This show is only possible. Remember, we say it every week, but it's true. It's only possible because of your support. Please consider a donation at kuow.org/politics. And by the way, thank you to everybody who gave to KUOW during the spring member drive. That was huge. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.